Hello everyone, today I want to explain to you about the 6 tenses in the German language. This class will really just run through those 6 tenses, and we'll discuss a lot really about verbs because tenses have to do with verbs. At this stage, perhaps if you're preparing for the Leaving Cert, you've done the oral, you've also looked a lot perhaps at the reading comprehensions, but I know, speaking for myself certainly, that at this stage when I was preparing for the Leaving Cert, I knew that the letter and the Äußerung zum Thema were one of the most difficult parts of the exam to predict. It is easy to go down the road of learning off lots of material on different topics for the letter and the Äußerung zum Thema, and that is indeed a good strategy. But even better is to know a little bit about how to form your own sentences with a wide variety of verbs. It's also worth noting that the verb tenses come up a lot in the Angewandte Grammatik section of the exam, which is worth 6.25%, I believe. So we'll talk about that later on. Now, what are the 6 tenses in the German language, and why do we have tenses? Well, of course we have tenses because tenses really make it easier to express shades of meaning. It's very important, for example, sometimes when you're dealing with any type of literature, knowing did something happen in the past, in the present, or was it a statement about the future, or even a statement about the conditional. The 6 tenses that are most important in the German language are, starting in the middle, the Präsens, which is the present tense. Then you typically learn the past perfect, which is the past tense that is most commonly used for conversations and letter writing, and that's the past tense you'll be using when you're writing your letter. Then you have the future tense, which is of course used for the future. It's a very simple tense in German. And then you have the imperfect tense, which is another type of past tense in German, and it's used for storytelling. Then you have the Plusquamperfekt, or the Pluperfect in English. That's used to talk about an event that happened before another event in the past tense. And then finally you have the conditional tense. I would put it right over at this side, and that is where you're talking about something that is what I say if. It's something that you're not sure is going to happen. It may happen. It's the conditional tense, or sometimes known as the conjunctive zwei. Now, all of this can be quite confusing, and so on my website handouts.ie I have this sheet which basically goes through the 5 tenses in German. It's by far the most popular sheet that's downloaded for free on the website, and you'll find it there. It goes from the present. I put the past in the middle because the past, there are, I guess, 3 tenses in the past in German, and I put the future over on this side. So the only tense that's not on this sheet is the conditional tense, but I will explain that in a moment. So what I want to do is talk firstly about the 5 or 6 different types of tenses and explain each one. Then I want to look briefly at the concept of irregular verbs, because they're very important when you're doing your Leaving Cert. And finally I want to look at all of the past questions on verbs which have come up throughout the years in the exam papers. And just to set it out at the start, there are 2 or 3 different ways that you're asked about verbs in the exam paper. For example, you're often given a sentence. In 2021, for example, you're given a sentence where a verb is underlined and the verb is not in the present tense. It might be in the imperfect, or it might be in the future, it might be in the plusquamperfekt, and you have to put it into the present tense. That's generally not a difficult exercise, but there can be 1 or 2 challenging questions thrown in. Another type of exercise is where you're given a sentence that has a verb in it, and the verb is underlined, and you have to write out 3 things about the verb. You have to write out what the infinitive of the verb is, you have to write out whether it's singular or plural, and then thirdly, what tense the verb is in. That type of question is probably a little bit nicer for somebody who has done their work on verbs, because it's easier to get marks. You're unlikely to lose 1/5 of the marks when you make a mistake. You'll only use one point out of the 3 on that particular question. So that's another way you're asked, and you can be asked to, in 2014 it did come up one year where you were given verbs, I think in the present tense, and you were asked to write them in the imperfect, which is a little bit more challenging, and that's one of the reasons why I want to look at irregular verbs a bit later on. So that brings us then to this part where I want to just explain very clearly and simply what a regular verb looks like when you put it through all of these 5 tenses. And again, I would say download that sheet and have a look at it as I go through this part of the video, and it will make it easier for you to follow along. So let's just take the verb wohnen. So the verb wohnen we know means to live. And in the present tense, and when you're dealing with verbs, when you're learning verbs, it's always best to look at the 3rd person singular. And the reason for that is because that is the part that changes if it's an irregular verb. So let's just go each time here with he lives. So we'll start first of all with the present tense, and I'll just write this out in German because it's nice in your exam if you're asked what tense is it, just to use the German. That's the Präsens. So the Präsens for that would be simply wohnt. That's the present tense, the Präsens, wohnt. Now, if you have an irregular verb in the present tense, it can change from, like, let's say, for example, if you had sehen, it's not seht, it's sieht. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Now, the next tense that you typically learn is the past perfect tense. So let's just write that out here. Past perfect, like that, spelled with a K when you write it in German. And this would just be he lived. It's hat gewohnt, like that. Now, this, the present tense, I should have written this here, it just means he lives, like that. When you move to the past tense, this just means simply he lived, like that. Hat gewohnt. And it's made up of two parts. The first part here, the two words you could say, this first part here is called the helping verb. The helping verb. And it doesn't mean he had lived or anything like that. It just means he lived. But this part here is called a helping verb. And this part here is called the participle. And when you form the participle in German, it's usually formed by a GE at the start of the stem and then a T at the end, as you can see from this diagram here. One thing just to be careful of is that verbs that show motion in German typically take sein as their helping verb, not haben. So I'll just give an example of that. If you took, for example, the verb he went, this would be ist gegangen, like that. So here the helping verb comes from the verb sein, and it's ist gegangen instead of hat gegangen. Why? Because it's a verb that shows motion. He went. The next verb tense then that you typically learn when you're learning German is the imperfect tense. This is sometimes called the Präteritum. Now, the imperfect tense in German, it means exactly the same thing as the past perfect. And the only difference is that it's used for storytelling, typically. So, wohnte, it's just one word, and there's often a T in it, maybe perhaps with a wasp before, or you add an extra E. Wohnte, he lived. Spielte, he played, and so on. So again, this just means he lived as well. But whereas this one up here is used for letter writing, so this is the one that you'll be using when your letters in conversation, when you're writing your letter, for example, in your Leaving Cert, you'll be using the past perfect. You might say, well, why are you telling me about the imperfect? Well, the imperfect is very important when you're, for example, understanding your reading comprehensions. That's where the imperfect is really, really important. So I'll just write here stories or storytelling, you could say. That's where the imperfect is critical to understand that. The next tense we'll take a quick look at is the Plusquamperfekt. So that's spelled in German. It's very long. Plusquamperfekt, like that. And the way I explain this tense is that if you said to somebody, for example, before the postman came, I had eaten breakfast. What you're telling that person is that I had eaten my breakfast before the postman came. And if you think about it, you don't say I ate my breakfast before the postman came. You could say that. But if you think of the phrase I had eaten, you're being very clear that you had eaten your breakfast before the postman came. So we could say, for example, the postman came. That's just the normal past tense. But when you say I had eaten, you're putting a bit of emphasis on the fact that you did it before another event in the past tense. So I always use this postman analogy. I find it's an easy way to remember the pluperfect tense. So if you were saying, for example, then he had lived, there's a very simple way of doing that. It's just hatte, which is a bit like the had idea. If you think of the imperfect of haben, hatte gewohnt, like that. And this would mean simply he had lived. And he had lived. And going back to this idea of verbs of motion as well, if we were to take ist gegangen, which means he went, and to say, well, in the pluperfect that would be he had gone, then the way to write that would be war gegangen. Like that. He had gone. So that's the Plusquamperfekt. Very important to be able to recognize that, even though you won't really be writing it in your letter. Then we come to another tense, and that is the future tense. Now, the future tense in German is very, very simple. If you want to say He will live, it's just wird, W-I-R-D, and then wohnen. He will live. Wird wohnen. Wird in Deutschland wohnen. So it's just the verb werden, W-E-R-D-E-N, plus the infinitive. The future tense in German is really quite easy to grasp. Now the final tense I want to just mention is conjunctive zwei, or as it's more colloquially known in English, the conditional tense. And this is the same as the mo conilach in Irish, where you're asked if you had a lot of money, what would you do with it? So you don't have a lot of money, but if you did, what would you do with it? And it often comes up in the letters, surprisingly, in German, where you're asked a question, for example, like, would your parents give out to you if you got a fine for cycling without a helmet, or something like that? And a lot of students will answer this and they'll just say, perhaps my parents are angry if I get a fine, which is the present tense, which is okay, and you will get marks for that, but it's much nicer if you can say my parents would be angry, or something along those lines. And the simple way of thinking about the conditional tense, we'll just call this the conjunctive zwei, is to there is a conjunctive eins, by the way, but the conjunctive zwei is the important one to know for the Leaving Cert. This would just be and then wurde, W-U-R-D-E, and then wohnen, like this. So würde wohnen, which means he would live, like this. And if you were to say he would go, würde nach Deutschland, or würde in die Stadt gehen, or würde in die Stadt fahren. So this is, again, a very useful tense to know. This is the conditional tense. Just a point to note here is that when you're using the conditional tense for the verbs sein and haben, it's more common to say, for example, if you were saying that would be great, it's more common just to use a form of it which looks like this, das wäre toll, like that, which is the way to say that would be great, das wäre toll. So when you're using the verb sein, something to be, that would be great. Or if you're saying, for example, if I had more time, I would do something, then you would be saying that the simplest way to say that is wenn ich mehr Zeit, and then hätte, which is really like the hatte of the imperfect with an umlaut added. Wenn ich mehr Zeit hätte. And then you'll be saying, würde ich nach Deutschland fahren, or something along those lines. So that's the conditional tense. Now at this point in this class, I just want to make a quick observation about irregular verbs. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with tenses? I do think it's just very important to point out that this is the tricky aspect of verbs, that there are irregular verbs in German. There is a sheet that I found that is very, very useful, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. So the first thing is really, what is an irregular verb? So just some quick notes, some revision notes here. So an irregular verb, most simply put, is a verb that changes in the second and third person singular in the present tense. Now this isn't always the case, but these are the general rules. So I'll give an example, and a good example would be the verb sehen. So when you say, for example, in German, ich sehe, we know that just stays ich, S-E-H-E. But when you change the do part, it's du siehst, S-I-E-H-S-T, and then oder sie sieht, like that. And we call this the second and third person singular. So if you ever hear somebody referring to that, it just means the second and third person singular because it's just one person. When you go on to the we and the you plural and the they, that's plural. So that would be the first, second, third person plural. But here you just have the second and third person singular. And you'll notice that the stem has changed. An I has been added in here. Now it isn't always an I that's added. For example, with the verb fahren, it changes from ich fahre to du fährst. That gets an umlaut. And then sie, es, man, fährt, like that. So one of the things you'll notice here is that it's the third person that really shows you what the pattern is going to be like. And that is the or sie part. So when you're learning an irregular verb, for example, if you learn the verb fahren, it's good just to learn it as fahren, fährt, ist gefahren. So put those three parts together, fahren, fährt, or maybe fuhr then as well. and then ist gefahren. So learn them off in a string like that. So you remember that fahren is the infinitive, but then fährt is the present tense irregular, and then you have the imperfect and the perfect after that. And finally, before we just move on to the second point here, just remember that sein, the verb sein, which is the verb to be, and the verb haben, which is obviously to have, they're two of the most irregular verbs in German. They're really, really odd, and the only way to learn them is just to learn them off by heart. Ich bin, du bist, sie, es ist, wir sind, ihr seid, sie sind, and then ich habe, du hast, sie, es, man hat, wir haben, ihr habt, sie haben. Just learn those off. They're irregular. Learn them off. It's really, really critical that you do that. The second point then, just very quickly about irregular verbs, is that if you have an irregular verb, it forms its past tense in a slightly different way to the regular ones. So for example, if you have a regular verb like, let's just say regular, let's just go back to the one that we learned already, which is the verb he lived. So hat in Deutschland gewohnt. You'll see here that you have the helping verb, and then you have ge here, so this is your g, and then you have a t up here at the end. Irregular verbs in German tend to form the past tense with an en instead. So for example, if you think about the verb that we've just used up here, sehen, and you wanted to say he saw, it would be hat gesehen, sehen. So generally speaking, anytime a verb is irregular in the present tense, it's an irregular verb, then it will form its past perfect with an en at the end of the stem instead of a t. It's just a useful a little rule to know. Similarly, when you have he travelled, so fahren, the irregular verb fahren, it's ist gefahren, like that. And of course there are some that are very irregular, for example the verb schwimmen, which changes to ist geschwommen. Now again, going back to the point, what's the best way to learn these? Well, there is another sheet on my website which has a list of verbs that's ideal for junior cert learners or junior cycle learners, and that's available on my website. But the best one that I found, I'll link in the description below. It doesn't belong to me, it's on a university website, but I have found it to be very, very useful and very, very accurate, and it's a brilliant sheet to learn off these irregular verb forms in the imperfect and in the past perfect. And it's a very decent sheet that will get you through the Leaving Cert very, very well. What I want to do now, without further ado, is to run through these 6 past tense papers questions under the Angewandte Grammatik question, which typically comes after text 1. And just to show you some examples of questions that were asked about verbs, how they were asked, and what the correct answers to give were. And as stated previously, there were different types of ways that these questions could be asked. So we'll go through each one step by step and see if we can learn them as quickly as we can. So the first example I'm going to look at here is 2021. And here we see that we were asked to schreiben Sie die folgenden unterstrichenen Verben im Präsens. So you were given a verb that wasn't in the present tense and you're asked to write it out in the present tense. And you don't need to write out the whole sentence actually, you can just get away with just writing out the verb. And it might be better to write out the whole sentence, but just for this example I'm going to just write out the verb. So the first one here is Noah ging zu einer Castingshow. And here we have the verb gehen in the imperfect, so the present tense would just be Noah geht zu einer Castingshow, like that. Wurde is he became, and we want to just put that in the present tense, so wird is in the present tense. Noah's erster Film gefiel Martin nicht, so the first one, Martin didn't please Martin, he didn't like it, so you want to change this to present, and this is the verb gefehlt. This is probably the most challenging one of them all in this list. Millionen Zuschauer sahen, so this would be sehen in the present tense. And finally, the last one, hatte, would just be hat. So here we've changed these 5 verbs into the present tense. That was a very nice question. So moving back then to 2019, here we have another question. And this time again, we were asked to write the verbs in the present tense. Let's go for it again. Ich besuchte Schulen in vielen verschiedenen Ländern. So the answer here was just ich besucht in the present tense. Again, we have the verb lost, or to lose, for verlor, and then this would just be verliert. Verliert. Meine Eltern und ich kamen nach Deutschland zurück. So we came back to Germany. So we want to just say kommen. The next one, aber auch in der deutschen Schule fand ich keine richtigen Freunde. This is just finde ich in the present tense. So I don't find any proper friends. And the last one, Johnny und seine Freunde waren. So this would just be sind. Sie sind für mich. Like that. So again, a very accessible question. Moving on then to 2018, here we see a different style of question. Each sentence has a verb in it that's underlined, and you have to give, regarding that verb, the infinitive, the Zeit form, that's the tense, and whether it's singular or plural. So looking at the first one here, we have Jason hat die ganze Nacht gearbeitet. And I always say that it's better to write out the verb first. So if you just write out here, we have hat ... gearbeitet. Now, one thing that throws students sometimes is they look at this and they think, oh, is this two verbs or one? Is it haben and arbeiten? And no, the answer is no, it's not. It's just arbeiten. And we know that the infinitive of arbeiten, gearbeitet, is just arbeiten. So that's the first thing we're asked to do. Then we're asked to give the Zeit form. And this is where the hat is important. So it's the perfect tense. The past perfect, and that's why you have the haben there, the hat gearbeitet. And finally then, is it singular or plural? We know looking at it, it's just Jason, so we would just say it's singular because it's just he. It's not we or you plural or they, it's just hat die ganze Nacht gearbeitet. One little tip I'll give here is do always give them in the right order. So for example, you're given the infinitive first, then the tense, and then whether it's singular or plural. You won't lose marks if you don't do that, but it just makes it easier for the examiner to correct your work and to fly through it and to give you full marks if you got them all correct. The second one here, Stella und Jason treffen sich zuerst in einem Flugzeug. So again, just write out the verb as it appears in the sentence as neatly as you can. And then give the infinitive. The infinitive here would just be sich treffen, and do put down the sich again. Then what tense is it in? Obviously this is in the present tense, so this is just the presens. They meet in a plane, and then it's plural this time because it's two people, Stella und Jason, two people, so it's they, sie treffen sich. The third example here, we have the verb sieht and then ... an. Now just be careful here, this is a separable verb, and when you're giving the infinitive of this verb, it's very important that you would write it out joined together with the prefix now at the start of the verb once again. So it's ansehen, to look at somebody or something. And this again is the present tense. It's not the imperfect, because if it was in the imperfect it would be sah, an. And it's a singular because it's just Jason that's doing the looking. Jason sieht Stella zornig und irritiert an. Moving on to number 4. Stella hatte schon als Kind Angst. Let's write out the verb. So it's just hatte. We know that the verb is haben. Now this means she had, even as a child, she was fearful. So this is the imperfect tense. And it's singular because it's just referring, it's just Stella. And finally, we come to the last one, which is trug. And this is, of course, the verb tragen, to wear or to carry. And it's in the imperfect again. And it's singular. Stella will never forget what she wore on this day. So those are the answers to this question. And again, just a little point that this can be a nice question to get, even though it's perhaps a little bit more work than the other style of question. You're likely to pick up more marks because you won't hopefully get 3 zeros, or you'll hopefully get 3 full marks. But if you were to make a mistake, you'd only use one of the marks in each line rather than all of the marks on each line. Moving on then to 2017, in this question you were asked again to write the underlined verbs in the present tense, and as you can see from the part that's already completed here on this paper, this was the second question in the grammar section. So here the first question you were asked was am liebsten las Abenteuerromane. So you want to say liest, so it's Liest, he reads adventure novels. And here's a good example of a verb that you would need to know the irregular tense. You do learn it for the junior cycle, usually generally in first year. So it's a really basic verb, but it's important to be very, very accurate and know how to spell it correctly. Then we move on to the next one, arbeitete. So this is just arbeitet. And moving on to the next one, gab or es gab. So this is just es gibt. The next one, einmal im Jahr fuhr. This is just fährt And the last one, gewinnt. So again, a very simple question. Moving on then to 2014. So a bit of a gap here. This question was perhaps a little bit more challenging because you're asked to write in the imperfect tense rather than the present. The example they give you here is Herr Leumer ist unfreundlich, and you have to change that to Herr Leumer war unfreundlich. Now this is not a difficult question if you have done your work. So here we see hat kein Interesse, and the answer here would just be hatte kein Interesse. And it would be better to write out the whole sentence, but just for the purpose of this exercise I won't do that. The next one, unterbricht ihn ständig, and this is probably the most challenging one here. This would be unterbrach ihn ständig. The next one, Herr Hönnekopf stellt Paul eine Tasse Kaffee hin. This is a regular verb, and it would just change to stellte hin. The next one, will ihm keine Lehrstelle geben. This is a modal verb. The modal verbs don't really follow the rules even of irregular verbs, and it's always better just to learn off the present tense and the imperfect tense of modal verbs. Do a separate little study on that yourself. Do a separate little study on that and know what those verbs are. Aber gibt ihm hilfreiche Ratschläge, and this would just be gab ihm. He gave him helpful suggestions. Moving on then finally to 2013. Here we see again the a little bit more demanding question where you have to write out the infinitive, the tense, and then whether it's singular or plural. So let's jump into it here. Ich hatte sehr viel Geld verdient. So again, just write out the verb as neatly as you can. Hatte verdient. And again, we're not interested in the hatte part. We just want to write out verdienen, because this is the infinitive of the whole verb. Now this was a lovely question. Hatte verdient. It's not ich habe verdient, which would be the past perfect. This time it's hatte verdient, which is of course the Plusquamperfect. I had earned. So harking back to what I said earlier in the video, this is a bit like the postman. I had eaten breakfast before the postman came. Here you're saying I had earned a lot of money, perhaps before I left my job or something like that. Plusquamperfect. And of course it's singular because it's just I, and it's not we or you, plural, or they. Then Franz nennt mich. So this is just N-E-N-N-T. The verb is nennen, to name or to call. It's the present tense, presens. Again, nicer to write out in German rather than in English. And it's singular because it's just Frank. Lud ein. Now this is a common style of question where we're given a separable verb. Just be very careful with them. So when you're writing out the infinitive, this of course means to invite, that you write out einladen, like that. It's in the imperfect tense. He invited me to Italy, and it's singular because it's just one person. He is doing the inviting. Und ich waren in den Zug nach Lugano gestiegen. So this is waren gestiegen, which means to embark or to get on the train. And again, it's not Eric und ich sind gestiegen, which would be the perfect tense, that we embarked on the train. It's we had embarked. So again, the verb is steigen, but it's not the perfect, it's the plusquamperfect. So this was a challenging question with two plusquamperfect verbs in it. You really needed to know your pluperfect tense. And of course this time it's the plural because it's not just ich, it's Erika und ich, and that's of course, you can see the waren, not just waren there as well. And finally, Kinder winkten uns zu. So this is clearly then again a separable verb. So it's zu winken, and this is the imperfect. And plural because it's not just one child, it's Kinder, it's children plural. So all the best with your study, and if you have any questions on this topic, of course, feel free to drop them in the chat below. Viel Spaß!